This won't be the case every time, but depending on the schools you're applying to, you may be asked to do an additional interview. For these interviews, an alumnus of the school or some other faculty at the school, or really just some person who works at the school or is affiliated with it, is going to reach out to you to schedule an interview. For the most part, there are two kinds of interviews you'll encounter: informational and evaluative. For informational interviews, they're really just what they sound like. They're really meant for you to get more information about the school. So you go into that interview and you are supposed to ask questions to the interviewer, and that interviewer is going to answer whatever questions you have. It's not really for that person to evaluate you in any way. They're really just there to help you get more information about the school, to help inform your decisions when you're applying and deciding on what schools to attend. On the other hand, evaluative interviews are exactly what they sound like as well. They're meant for whoever's interviewing you to evaluate your character, and this does contribute to your admissions to a limited extent. It's really going to depend on the specific school that you're interviewing for and how much they place value on those interviews. For top schools especially, I don't really think the interviews have that much power in admissions and swaying the decision one way or another. But for some other schools, I know that interviews do play a bigger part. So it's really going to depend on which schools you're applying to and how much value they place on these interviews. If you're a high school student who just finished applying to colleges and just got asked to do one of these interviews, chances are this might be your first time ever doing this sort of interview. So let me break it down for you guys. In most cases, your interviewer will reach out to you by email and they'll ask you to schedule where and when you guys want to meet. Chances are it's going to be in some public location, usually like a cafe or a library. Some cases, they may even do it at a school. And then once you guys meet up, you'll sit down, you'll introduce yourselves to each other, you'll ask and answer questions. The interviewer is going to do most of the asking, you'll do most of the answering. And then once that's over, the interviewer will sort of wrap things up, ask you if you have any questions. And then after that, you guys will say goodbye to each other and then go off on your merry little ways and probably never see each other again. The length of the interview itself really depends on your interviewer and what kind of conversation you guys are having. I remember some interviews, like the one I had for Penn, went on for only like 20 minutes, but the one that I had for MIT went on for like 2 hours. Most of my interviews were in between that, usually around the 1 hour mark. I think for the most part, the interviews you'll have will also probably be around an hour, but of course there are extreme cases where your interviews will be a lot shorter or a lot longer. At these interviews, you'll probably get asked the same questions. They'll ask you to tell them about yourself. They'll ask you why you want to attend the school that you're interviewing for. They'll ask you why you want to study, what it is you want to study. And they'll also ask you about like other things going on, like your school, extracurricular activities and things like that. And depending on how the conversation goes and how you answer each question, they'll also ask you follow-up questions based on like how you respond. To prepare for these interviews, I'd recommend you ask someone to sit down with you and pretend to be your interviewer and have them ask questions as if they were your actual interviewer. And that way you can practice and come up with more prepared answers for going into your interviews so that you have like a nice, really well formulated response to the common questions you'll get asked. But you should also be prepared to think on your feet because these interviewers are going to ask you follow-up questions based on how you respond to those initial questions. And they might also ask you some other questions that you may not necessarily expect. So while you can prepare for some questions, for other questions, you should be prepared to think on the fly. For these interviews, I would recommend going somewhat business casual in terms of your attire. You don't really need to be like full formal, wearing like a full suit and tie or like a really fancy dress. It's okay to just be business casual because it's really more to be like a casual conversation between you and the interviewer, not really like a super formal, like high stakes interview, because in most cases it's not that high stakes. So just don't stress too much about like what to wear and just be normal. And speaking of being normal, I think that these interviews are partially to see if you're like a normal person, because sometimes you can't really assess that through the application itself, and people can sound normal on paper and just be weird in person. So I would say in your interviews, try to have like good etiquette and just be like a normal person. Don't like be weird or anything, because that's gonna signal red flags to your interviewer and you don't really want that. So just as much as possible, and I know as hard as it may sound, just be normal, please. But like I said earlier, these interviews probably only contribute minimally to your overall admissions because interviews don't really play that super big of a role. And this makes sense because not everyone gets an interview. It really depends on like interviewers being available in your area to interview you. So if you don't get an interview, that doesn't really mean that you are not going to get accepted into that school, as well as like the length of the interview also doesn't really matter. You could have an interview that's really short or really long, like the ones that I had, and it really has no effect on your admissions. The school that I had a 20-minute interview at, I got waitlisted. The school that I had a 2-hour interview at, I got rejected. And some of the schools that I had a 1-hour interview at, I did get accepted in. So really, I don't think these interviews play a super big part in whether or not you're admitted. So just try to like calm your nerves and just go into it being a normal person. And since the interview doesn't really do too much for your admissions, I think that if you have a very good interview, that can be like a boost to your application. And if you have a very bad interview, that can like harm your application. But for the most part, if you have like a somewhat average interview, then it's not really going to swing your application one way or another too much. So try not to let the interview stress you out too much, and try not to let the nerves get to you. Just go in there, have a good time, have a good conversation. And at the end of the day, whatever happens, happens. And with that being said, for all of you who have college interviews coming up, I wish you the best of luck. Some schools ask students to make a video portfolio in place of a college interview. So if that applies to you and you're interested in hearing advice on how to do this video portfolio, check out this video here, or feel free to check out any of the other videos that I have on my channel.